So here's a demo on rendering the cone. I've started by placing my underlay below my paper. I also have my extra backing paper, which is just copy paper in this case. I put 2 sheets there to absorb my excess marker. And so on the cone we have the extra challenge of doing a gradation like we do on the cylinder, where we have a highlight and a core shadow, but it's got to come to a point. So generally speaking, I render in the direction of the surface. So you see that I'm actually starting on the left side and with straight lines, keeping the marker on the paper at about this speed. I'm wetting the paper down. And I will make a mark right here for my core shadow and one for my highlight. At this point, I'm going to remove my guide and place it right there. So at this point, I feel that I can move into 10. And you watch as I actually don't start right at the highlight or at the edge. I'm actually going to go to one of the sides. In this case, I'm going to go to the lightest side of our object. And more passes, meaning just more strokes on top of each other near the edge. I can actually simulate the transition just by spending less time on the paper as I move over. Now, at this point, as I was saying with the gradation, you can actually go back to your blender and make sure that this blend is going to be nice and soft, because this is a critical area. And technically, I could just leave it right there. But I'm going to go into this with 10 one more time. That's a bit too much, so I'm going to hit it with the blender right away, soften that edge that was forming. Now, I will do this sometimes, cross over that edge to get it to blend a little bit more. And then I always check my paper. Now you can see where it's really wet. You can also see a slight stain developing. Not too bad right now. Mainly what I want to do is make sure that my paper isn't staying wet. And that little bit of buckling you're seeing, that indicates the paper is saturated. There is such a thing as oversaturating your paper. If you do that, you're going to get those puddles underneath, which will tend to cause you to render too much in an area because it'll never darken for you. So that was the blender again. I'm going to switch back to my 10. So basically the way I treat this is like a ghost rendering. I actually render like I'm doing the entire thing in 0 and 10%. You can see I'm turning to get the tip up here for control, while turning the marker to get the larger wedge shape down here. And I work in from the right edge the same way I worked in from the left edge. And I lighten my pressure, a little bit like sketching at this point. I kind of speed up a bit too, just to have my marker on the paper a little bit less. But I do want a nice steady fill. I made a little bit of a mistake. I lost my bright highlight just short of the tip. We'll go with this though. I'm just now passing where my core shadow is going to be. But I got to keep my eye on where that highlight goes, because it don't want to lose it all together at the tip. I can probably go back and with a little bit of white pencil and fix that. So right about here you see I have a line forming, or an edge. I'm going to take the blender now because the paper got a little drier. And I'm going to blend across that and soften it. And this is where your paper can magically just blend for you and soften. Just be patient with it, give it about a minute. And let it do that blending for you. Now when you lift it up, it looks like that. It's really hard to tell what's going on. That's what happens when you have no white behind it. When I place it down, I can actually see my tones. The other thing is, you can see I've got a bit of a stain right there. What I'm going to do, actually I'll move my top paper. This happens a lot. I'm always attentive to whether I'm getting a buildup. I'm going to move it over here at this point. And now I can see it a little more clearly. It creates a shadow underneath, and you may actually try to render an area that's already rendered if you let the pigment build up underneath. switching to the fine tip end of the 10, I'm going to just sketch in a little bit of tone down here because it wasn't quite consistent. Now you can do this. You can actually see my sketching pattern is just reabsorbing into the paper. If the paper's wet, it'll do that for you. As long as it's wet, the markers will behave like a watercolor. When they dry out, you're going to get, well, you're going to get this. You're going to get a little sketch pattern. Looks like my 20 might be getting a little bit dry, but we're going to go with it. I can blend that. I got to get a field of nice rich tone like that. So I'm going to start again from the right edge, not next to the highlight, and I'm going to work towards my highlight. And you notice too, I've really maintained clean edges so far. Now up here is where I got to be careful. I got to narrow down that tone so I don't lose more of my highlight. Down here I can use the broad tip again. Get more careful as I get near the tip. And I get this tone placed in, and you can see I get another little bit of an edge. That's going to happen in your rendering. Now our objective on this exercise, all these exercises, is to make a non-reflective surface, no texture, no reflectivity, which means all our transitions are soft and gradual. That's what it's all about. We will very soon get into rendering reflective surfaces with the chrome object and the glass object, and then the chrome faucet. So be patient, just kind of work your way through these exercises. This is a good exercise, the cone and the cylinder, because it really, excuse me, they both make you think about directionality in your strokes, the way you actually apply your strokes so I'm following these contours. I've not yet added 20 over here. I'm holding off on that. Reason is I want to get this dark side darkened more. Now, I may actually push my core shadow a bit farther to the right. You can do that as you see your render evolving. Maybe I want that core shadow to be out here. It's entirely doable. I am going to switch to my 30. Not a big jump, we're taking this slow. Now 30 is about as dark as I want the right side of my cone. That is going to be reflected light, which means now I'm going to start working out from the core shadow, and that's a big change here. Just like with the cylinder, when I get the base tones on right and left on both sides of the highlight, and when I reach the lightest tone on the right side in the shadow, I'm going to now switch to the core shadow. Same diagonal, straight, but diagonal strokes. And now this is where I'm actually going to start developing that core shadow that's going to give it true depth. And by the way, I would approach the pencil drawing of the cone the same way. Working in from the left and the right, preserve the highlight. Strokes following the contour. Now the paper remains wet here, so I can get away with a bit of sketch technique there. I'm going to switch back to my 10 because I got a really rapid transition now right here. I'm going to soften that. It was actually a 20, that's okay. I'm going to go to the blender. And we're going to allow the paper to blend and soften this transition. So my right side, as you can see from this example, much darker here. I've got a ways to go yet. And my highlight is too wide at this point, so I left myself extra space to start pushing it over towards the left. And I'm going to do that check. You can see I've got a little bit of staining. This time I'll move the sheets that are underneath. I also have two sheets. I do that sometimes because they'll be more absorbent, and then I strip off the top sheet. Okay, so the area, I'm not going to re-wet the highlight because I want to make sure that I can blend into it a little bit more. You can see it's starting to take on some dimension. So at this point, I want to readdress the core shadow again. This time I have a brush tip marker. This is actually a point where the brush tips are really kind of superior, doing a soft blend on both sides. It's like having a watercolor brush that actually can work like a pencil. And so you can see I'm getting that darker halo happening here. My paper is buckling a little bit. This is a new pad of paper. It seems like it's a little bit different than my previous. Not sure why. You never know. Sometimes they make material changes in the product. Now I'm going to hit it with a 30, and you can see I'm lined up with my mark where I wanted my core shadow. I'm going to darken again. I think I can be a little bit more aggressive with this. And at this point, I feel that I can jump to 40. You will find as you get more comfortable with the markers, as we get into the 6 textures, that you'll skip tones. You won't have to go through every tone. I could do this with basically 3 tones if I had to. You know, like a 10, a 30, and a 60 maybe, and create almost virtually the same effect just by how I handle the markers. It is doable, a little riskier. But you do have the advantage of spending less time on the paper, so you get less of the puddling underneath. Now, if you find that your paper is buckling a lot, mine is buckling quite a bit right now, you can back off at this point, let this dry, give it 5 minutes, and then come back and re-wet with your 10 in your blender. So you can actually continue the process after your markers are dried. As long as you keep those soft blend edges, or actually no edges, and just keep the blend soft, that's perfectly doable. So what I'm going to do here is pull a little bit more of that dark tone over, but not with the 40. I'm going to re-wet my highlight area again and see if I can broaden out this transition. And then I'm really repeating the sequence. I go to 0, which is the blender, go to 10 or 20 to get more midtones, and I bring them a little farther into the highlight. So I don't want to see a step pattern. That's the main thing, but I do want to see a full, steady progression, a gradation of tones. You can see I've lost my highlight right up there. Now I could probably address that with a white pencil a little bit. So if you look, as I lift it now, you can get it actually remains visible. The tones are becoming more well established, so you can see what I've got. I've got a little bit of actually that's wet right there, so this highlight is holding up pretty good. Now at this point, I'm actually going to switch to the left side one more time, and I'm going to call that done as soon as I drop in a 20. And I am using the fine tip of the marker this time because I'm up against that edge and I would like to keep it clean. You notice I'm kind of sketching in this tone. What I'm going to do is smooth it by going back to either a 10 or a blender will do the trick, and I'm going to get the paper wet again and see how that just softens out. But I get that last turn of tone. Actually, the shape turns like it's going out of view because the tone is constantly changing. The left side was looking flat at that point compared to what I had done on the right side because I didn't have the last tone change in. I think I can push this a little farther, get a little more drama, so I'm re-wetting this left side of the highlight, and we're going to repeat that again. Actually, this time I'm braver. I'm going to use the broad tip, just a light touch at the top. And I'm going to call the left side done for the moment. Now, at this point, all things being relative, I really need that cast shadow in there to judge whether I'm dark enough on the right side of the cone. Cast shadow, I have not marked a tone in here, but I'm just going to start with 40. It is going to be my lightest tone in the cast shadow. And as I probably have already said by now, cast shadows need to have a tone change too, just like the object itself. I generally make the shadow get lighter subtly as it gets farther away from the object. Reason being that more ambient light moves into the shadow as the shadow progresses away from the object. It's also tone perspective in the sense that if you want to make something look a little bit farther away, you can either make it get a little bit lighter, or in some cases you can actually have it progressively get a little darker. So you can do create perspective with tone changes, not just with using linear perspective and a horizon line and that. But we normally think of perspective. This will translate directly into using color. If I was doing a shadow in color, this entire render was in color, I would actually perhaps make it cooler up against the object and a little warmer as it went farther away. It really depends on what the base tone of the object and the shadow we're sitting on are. Now I've just used 40, and let's see if I have an available 50, because I think I can push this tone. Here we go. That's pretty dark. That's actually, let's go with 70. Let's get the drama. Right up against the object. You notice I actually put a stroke right along the edge of the cone to preserve that clean edge. And I kind of scatter my tone out like that. Now I'm going to go back to my 40. And this is where I get rid of that sketchy blend because the paper's still wet. It's going to smooth this out for me. And this is how I go from 70 to 40, using just a 70 and a 40 and nothing in between. Oops, made a mistake there. That's okay. Got a little loose. But you can see how the paper is blending out the difference between the 40 and the 70. It's getting rid of the sketchiness. And I actually I'm going in with the clear blender just to touch up the end of it. And now you can see it really looks like there's a dark halo up near the object. Nice smooth transition up to the tip. Looks like it's going back in space. I can also assess, am I dark enough here? I feel I'm not. I feel I can get this core shadow stronger. It looks a bit weak compared to this cast shadow. Everything is relative in rendering. As I do a render, I adjust tones according to what's happening in each part of the render or illustration. If, for example, you darkened your shadows, you probably have to make some adjustments also on your light areas. Even the highlight might have to get a little bit darker. It depends on the space you're working in, the light space environment, lighting environment, let's say, that you're creating for your render. It would be the same issue if you were setting this up as a CGI render. If you're setting up bright spotlight, your highlights are probably going to be blown out. And so you're going to say to yourself, well, I need not to have my highlights blow out the detail on the light side of the object, so I'm going to weaken the intensity of those spotlights, and maybe I want to use a different light. Maybe I want to put a virtual shade over that light just to soften it, but still have it very bright. In a sense, I'm kind of making all those decisions with markers here, except I'm not using real lights. I'm creating just the illusion of a certain kind of light hitting this object. Because I'm not creating any kind of reflective edge, I'm saying to the viewer, this is a non-reflective surface that has a fairly dramatic main light source and a weaker secondary light source, perhaps a reflected light source coming in from the right side into the shadow. Now you can see just by strengthening that core shadow, I actually make the object look more dimensional. It pops forward from the cast shadow. And you can see my edges are pretty clean. There's my residue. At this point, I'm just going to lift one of these pieces of paper out so I have a nice clean base, and I'm going to finish. And you can see I'm kind of using a fast sketch mode and I call it tickling in a little bit of tone where I feel like I need a bit more. As long as that paper is wet, you can see if it glistens a little bit, the base of the paper itself is still wet enough to receive the tone and blend it out. I like to do my marker renderings wet and wet. Wet into wet, meaning one session with the paper maintained in a wet state and adding all my tones as quickly and efficiently as possible, and then when I feel I'm there, I let it dry. After it's dry, I'll elect to do any fine tuning. Maybe on the certain areas or maybe on the entire piece. If I do that, I'm going to have to re-wet those areas so that I can do the same thing again. I would usually start the same sequence. For example, I still have this paper wet, but I'm going to show you that I feel like my highlight is a bit too wide. It really should line up here. It's really lining up about there. How do you fix that? Well, wet the right side and start pulling some of that tone right in. You can actually pick up some of this tone, but don't scrub. Scrubbing will cause your paper to start becoming blotchy because you're actually upsetting the rag surface of it. Plus you're actually building up tone on the paper and starting to pull tone out, which is counterproductive. So what I did is I just re-wetted the right side of the highlight towards the drop core shadow. And now I'm actually dropping in 20 and letting that blend between the core shadow and the highlight. I hate when that happens. Markers like to run away on the floor. But there you go. You can see how I've built the basic environment. I've got my main highlight, my core shadow. I have a fairly full transition in between. I can keep pushing this highlight over as I was just by going back in and say adding a bit more tone. And you notice I don't start right at the edge. I start near to the core shadow. And then I blend towards the edge of the highlight because the highlight is the most delicate thing and the easiest thing to screw up in a render because there's not a lot of tone there. Remember, this is a transparent media. It can go light to dark, but it doesn't really go from dark to light. So you can't easily lighten an area that's already gone too dark. You do a little bit of it, but not much. And voila, we have basically, this is the base render. So if this was an object with, say it was a stone cone, oh, say a marble, I could now start putting my marble texture onto this at this stage. And then I would actually resume reestablishing tones on top of my texture and then strengthen the texture back to tone and build a textured marble object out of this render. So this would be the base render stage 1 in a finished, say, product render.